ask questions as they come up for you. And then in that interest, I just want to like turn everyone on to a fun Zoom feature. If you're on mute and you want to just like come off mute really quickly, you can just like hold your space bar in and then you're off mute and you can talk. And then when you let go of your space bar, your mic is off again. So, you know, fun trick for those of us trying really hard to avoid dogs or children being heard in the background. All right. Thank you for those of you who are participating in the chat, Landon, Regina, and Rosa. I really appreciate that. And other folks, if you want to do that, please feel welcome. I'm going to go ahead and get rolling. And we very well may finish short of the 1 hour mark, in which case we'll just return time to your day. But please feel welcome to ask questions and interrupt as we go along. All right. Firstly, who am I? My name is Wes Sanders Hahn-Burgess, but please call me Wes. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Director of Development and Communications at Georgia Equality. We are the statewide LGBTQ advocacy group working to advance non-discrimination protections and other important legislation for the LGBTQ community and also for people living with HIV and AIDS. And I've been here at Georgia Equality for 9 years and in my current role for 2. Let me say from the outset, I'm not a lawyer. We're going to be talking about some like tax code things today from the IRS largely. I'm not a lawyer. This is not intended to be legal advice, but it is intended to hopefully like spur some thinking on your parts about how you can incorporate advocacy and lobbying into your work without getting in danger of going astray of what is allowed by the tax code. So I have my master's degree in public administration and nonprofit management from the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies. I have 1 husband and 1 dog and 0 kids. And there is my husband and I'm the white guy on the right. And this was on a trip he and I took at some point. We were very embarrassingly riding a 4-wheeler with weird helmets. All right. This is the agenda for today. And at the end, you'll see there's time for questions. But as I said, please interrupt as we're going through. We're going to start with, something many of us likely know as a 501c3 organization, but we're going to start with specifically how the IRS defines a 501c3 organization and the pieces of that. And then we'll talk a little bit about what advocacy is and what lobbying is, and then what of those things 501c3 organizations are allowed to do. And then we're going to talk about specifically like parties and activities in elections and what of those nonprofits are allowed to do. So that's where we're going to, that'll sort of guide our time together today. And then if you have, at the end it says questions and scenarios, and I mean, so if you're thinking like, here's an activity that we're thinking about doing, or you once saw a nonprofit do, was that legal? I'll tell you maybe what I think, but again, definitely not a lawyer. All right. Still got some folks joining. If you've joined late, welcome in. We really appreciate you being here. You haven't missed anything yet. If you want to drop your name and organization and where you're calling in from into the chat, that would be great, just so we can get a sense of who's on the call. All right, so let's start with what is a 501c3 organization according to the IRS. So firstly, you might sometimes hear these organizations referred to as charitable organizations. That's the like shorthand for it. But what a 501c3 organization must be is organized and operated. Those things meaning like you have to file the proper organizing documents with state and federal authorities. You've got to get a C3 letter from the IRS. And then operated meaning you're having like regular board meetings, you're filing taxes regularly. Operated exclusively for exempt purposes. There's obviously a list of the purposes in the tax code in this particular section. Section 501c is like a long-ish list of many different types of nonprofits. And many of us work for organizations that find themselves in 501c3. At Georgia Equality, we have a 501c3, a 501c4, and a PAC. and I'll explain a little bit about those two things in just a minute. But it's just because under the tax code, different organizations, different tax entities are allowed to do different things and prohibited from doing different things. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. One of those things that a 501c3 or C3 for short is prohibited from doing is it's not, none of its earnings may inure to any private shareholder or individual. Nonprofits do not exist for profit, nonprofit, right? It doesn't mean you can't pay your employees. It just means that there's not, you know, when you get to the end of the year, if there's a giant profit, you don't get to split that among people like they would with a public sector entity if you owned, you know, shares in whatever. Also, if a nonprofit dissolves, the remaining money in the budget can't just like go to an individual, right? There are laws governing how that money has to be transferred, and generally it has to be transferred to another nonprofit organization. So that's what that means. And then the next thing here is it may not be an action organization, and by that they specifically mean not attempting to influence legislation as a substantial part of its activities. Pay attention to that word, substantial part of its activities, and it may not participate in any campaign activity for or against a political candidate. So we're going to really be diving into this bullet point today. And so we're talking about two things. The first part being influencing legislation, the second part being influencing elections. So the last part is that the donations that you receive as a 501c3 are tax deductible on the part of the donor. So let's do one more slide, and then I'm going to pause quickly just to see if anyone has questions. So these are the three different types of nonprofits that I just mentioned to you. Again, let me reiterate, there are way more types than this, like, you know, business entities or business, like chambers of commerce, I think are 501c6s, fraternities and sororities fit in here in the 501c section, they have another number. But for the most part, all of us are representing 501c3s. And so we'll talk largely about that, but we'll do a little bit of comparison first. So a 501c3, you see that it's tax deductible in terms of contributions, and it's tax exempt, meaning it doesn't pay taxes. We're going to learn more about a 501c4 and PAC, but it's just that they are able to do lobbying and elections. So continuing on the 501c3 side, limited lobbying activities, and we're going to talk more about this, but just no substantial part of your work can be lobbying, and there's more to say about that. A 501c4 can do unlimited lobbying, and a PAC can also do lobbying, but it's very rare. You wouldn't set up a PAC to do lobbying. That's not what it's set up for. And when it comes to those last pieces, elections that we were talking about, 501c3s cannot do anything in relation to a candidate in an election. They can do bipartisan or nonpartisan activities in an election, and we'll talk a bit more about that. 2 501c4s can do electoral activities pertaining to candidates, but it has to be a secondary purpose, not the primary purpose. And then a 527 or a PAC, you've probably heard, Political Action Committee, can do unlimited electoral activities, and that's why you set that up. So as I said before, at Georgia Equality, we have a C3, a C4, and a PAC. They obviously all keep separate, like bank accounts and separate works and accountings and all of that. And it's important to keep the work separate for tax reasons, but very common for organizations to have more than one of these set up to increase the flexibility of what you can do in the advocacy and lobbying space. So let me stop here. This is sort of a primer. The next thing we're going into is we're going to start with what is advocacy, but I'll stop at just a little brief description for any questions that folks may have. Please don't be shy. Let me know if you have questions. Any questions right now? Okay.
And thus far.
Great. So we're going to start with what is advocacy. And I'm going to I swear this is the only time I'm going to ask you to participate. well, maybe the only time, but the first time I'm going to ask you to participate with like getting on the mic. But if folks can just like shout out 1 or 2 word things that you think what advocacy is, or like examples of advocacy. Don't be shy.
A voice.
A voice, yeah. Come on.
We've got
1 or 2 words.
Nina in the chat saying support. Ladira saying seeking some sort of justice. Landon says coalition building for common purpose.
Totally. Yeah. So there are lots of definitions there are lots of actions in advocacy, which is sort of what I was hoping to get at with several different answers. So thank y'all for doing that. These are just a couple other things that are advocacy as we see them, right? Like educating legislators, community organizing, community education, litigation, get out the vote, nonpartisan voter engagement, encouraging voting, lobbying, and political partisan activity are all technically advocacy, right? Yeah, you know, saying education and defending a cause. Andre, thank you. Yeah, so these are all the different things of advocacy, and the question that we're going to talk about today is where and why does the IRS draw the line on what a 501c3 can do? This is where I draw the line as like an example of what they're going to let us do. All the stuff above the line, you're good to go. Anything below the line is a no-go. And then the line is drawn through lobbying because you can do it, but like a little bit. So let's talk a little bit more about advocacy, and then we're gonna try to understand what the distinction is between the lobbying you can and can't do. Just another note on advocacy. Also, I don't know if this is the first GIF or not, but this is a very GIF heavy presentation because I think they're fun. So this is a little turtle not giving up the fight. So advocacy is ongoing, and meaning like there are going to be setbacks. It's going to happen. It has to happen. You can't be discouraged. And as a consequence, when you have victories, no matter their size, you need to celebrate them. The first like 3 or 4 years I was working at Georgia Equality, we just like were playing a ton of defense on legislation and couldn't like break through and get some things done in the proactive, and it was like banging your head against the wall. But you keep at it, and eventually you can achieve the goals you set out. Again, change takes time, but we have to like continue our sense of urgency. And I think important for organizations who are considering doing advocacy is like making specific space for working to make sure that your goals align with the goals and needs of the community that you're advocating for, which means like, checking in and making sure people in that community are part of your work, or an important part of your work, or like the base for your work. Okay, so that's advocacy. Okay, so when does advocacy become lobbying? Let me say there are 2 different types of lobbying according to the tax code. There is direct lobbying, and there's grassroots lobbying. So one example of direct lobbying is encouraging legislators to propose or support or oppose legislation or budget items, meaning like specific legislation, right? Dear Representative so-and-so, please support House Bill 527 or whatever the number is, right? We've mentioned a specific legislator, a specific piece of legislation. And we are, as the organization, we're talking to the legislator, right? That's direct lobbying. Grassroots lobbying is if we ask our supporters or the public to do that same thing. So this happens a lot for Georgia Equality when we say like, we email our members saying, the Senate is going to do something with this really horrible anti-gay adoption bill. As an example, please email your senator right now and tell them to vote against Senate Bill 123. So again, we're asking people to reach out to a specific legislator and to talk about a specific bill. The third one, I didn't label direct or grassroots because it sort of can depend on how you end up doing it, that it would classify it as one or the other. But I just wanted to make sure and stress that it doesn't have to just be the legislators you're talking to. Communications with or to executive offices also count, and by executive I mean president, governor, mayor, like the heads of the governing body. So communications with them about a specific bill would also be considered like direct lobbying, for example. All right, so let's think about who, you know, with the tax code, everything is very precise, right? So who are the people that qualify under this act as you're lobbying if you're talking to these people? Who is lobbied? As we said, the U.S. House and Senate and staff, that's important, and their staff are included in this. State House, Senate, and staff, so the state level, and then city councils and county boards of commission and their staff, and then obviously executive officers, as we said, and their staff. So this is who can be lobbied, meaning like if you're talking to people, it might be lobbying. Well, there's also a list of, I think later in the presentation, have a list of like who you're not lobbying if you're talking to them. So it's talking to that list of specific people about legislation, right? And so what does that mean? What is legislation? This would be like a House bill, House resolution, Senate bill, or Senate resolution, but it doesn't matter if it's been introduced, if it's been completely written, or if it's like in a draft form of a bill and they haven't been introduced yet. If it's a specific piece of legislation that they're working on, that's what qualifies. You can't talk about it. You talk about it as an issue, right? Not oppose conversion therapy or not oppose Bill 527. You say oppose conversion therapy. You keep it on the issue, and you're good if you keep it there. A couple of things that are not considered legislation. So there is no restriction on how much you can encourage folks to be active on these and talk to their folks about these, or even that your organization can take a stance on these without any fear of being accused of lobbying. Is like regulations, executive orders, and litigation. Commenting on those things is not lobbying. Regulations being like the state Medicaid waiver, it's a regulation. Executive order, we obviously, under President Trump, are very familiar with executive orders. So anything that is just signed by the executive but not passed by the legislature, you're free to talk about those. Court cases, litigation, you're obviously free to talk about those as well. Those are not pieces of legislation. Does anyone have questions? We'll pause right here for just a second.
Mina asked, can you give an example of what you cannot do?
Yes. I think we're headed there. Well, let's talk about what is not lobbying, and then we'll talk about how much you can lobby. But yes, we're coming to that for sure. More things that are not lobbying. All of these things you can do. Feel welcome and encouraged. As I said, issue advocacy, advocacy on regulations, for or against executive orders. This is a good one that is important for folks to know. Advocacy for enforcement of existing laws. If you look over here on the right, this is an example of a piece of advocacy that Georgia Equality was doing. This was asking folks to specifically target the Department of Housing and Urban Development around trans housing needs. This one is a regulation, right, through an administrative department. But in something like housing, there are existing like non-discrimination laws on housing and other laws around housing. If you're just asking that the law as written be enforced, that's not lobbying. Other things that are not lobbying, again, litigation, administrative advocacy, which is what this is, advocacy to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Other things that are not considered lobbying are if you're communicating with school boards or zoning boards or housing authorities. Those are not lobbying. All right. So here's the thing. 501c3s can lobby. You are allowed to lobby. The way that the section 501c3 is written is that it may not be a substantial part of your work. No substantial part is what the code says. That is super vague, right? What does that mean, no substantial part? Lots of people have guesstimated about maybe it means less than 50%, maybe it means 25%, maybe it means 20%. And you can certainly operate in that space of, you know, trying to figure out what that means to you and deciding how much risk you want to take. If you're interested in making lobbying a part of your work as a 501c3 organization, which, like, as someone who works for a 501c3 organization that works, if it lobbies, I really have to, like, encourage that, right? Like, lobbying on behalf of your mission is mission work. There is an expenditure test called 501H, a separate section in the tax code, where you can, basically the IRS through a test will tell you exactly how much money you can spend on lobbying. It will just draw the line for you so you know exactly where it is and you won't go over it. So it's called the 501H election. It has to be done, like, affirmatively by the organization. You have to file a piece of paperwork to say that you want to do it. And it is based on annual expenses for the organization. With it, it means that you have to track what you're doing. You have to track them. It's based on the amount of money you spend on lobbying activities. And then you'll have to report all of that with the 990 when you file the 990. It mentions, again, two kinds of lobbying, grassroots and direct lobbying. And there are two different amounts. So I pulled this next one from the IRS website. This is the 501H expenditure test. This is the direct lobbying portion. So on the left is budget size, expenses. So find where your organization is on that list, and then look to the right, and that is how much you can spend on lobbying on top of the budget, right? So if you're a smaller organization, less than $500,000, 20%, you can spend 20% of whatever your number is on lobbying. So again, this is on the IRS's website, so you can look there to find it. But it's just that there is you can, if you want to do it, if you want to have lobbying in your work plans for your organizations, but you have concerns, or maybe you have, you know, your managers or executive directors have concerns and just say, we can't do it, we don't want to lose our status. Here's a way that you can get a very clear standard and you just don't cross it, and you don't have to worry about what you're doing. All right, here's another question. What about lobby days? So we at Georgia Equality do a couple of lobby days every year. We always do, at the very least, we do a people living with HIV in Georgia lobby day and an LGBTQ in Georgia lobby day. So this is the graphic from this year. Funnily enough, we did manage to have AIDS Watch in Georgia this year before the pandemic shut everything down. I think it was in February. But these absolutely, even though you're going to the Capitol, even though you're talking to legislators, these absolutely can be done in a 501c3 compliant way. Talking to a legislator about what it means to be a person living with HIV, or what it means to be a person in HOPWA-funded housing, or what it means to be a person who's gets access to their medicine through Ryan White, whatever it is, none of that is legislation, right? Talking about any of those things is not legislation. So bringing people to the Capitol, one of the things that we do for AIDS Watch every year is just make sure that every year that each legislator, as many legislators as we can get, have heard from one person living with HIV in the state of Georgia, right? That's, for many of them, 100% more than they would have gotten without us, right? And they're not talking about individual or specific pieces of legislation, they're talking about their life. So educating policymakers on personal stories or issue advocacy, as we said before, totally 501c3 compliant, no mention of specific legislation is the only thing you have to worry about there. Now, the second bullet point here is if you do a 501 lobbying day that you're trying to keep compliant, it is possible that you will incur some, depending on what you have your staff doing, you may incur some lobbying expenses, right? Like if folks are going and talking to their legislators and talking about their need for housing, and then you're following up with, and that need for housing can be satisfied by voting yes on House Bill whatever, the actions of the staff person there are considered lobbying, and so you'd have to just record the expense for that staff time. So you can incur lobbying expenses, but also, like, you know, just going and telling your story is not lobbying. And more importantly, when we do AIDS Watch in Georgia each year, if ASOs and other organizations working with people living with HIV send their folks to our event, and their folks are doing issue advocacy and that's it, and then Georgia Equality, as the organization that does it regularly, is able to follow up with those on the specific lobbying, the other organization has not engaged in lobbying at all. There's no non-501c3 compliant actions. So lobby days are totally possible, and you really should be doing them, I think, from a non-lawyer, but just advocate's perspective. All right, so now we've talked about lobbying and advocacy and what you can and can't do. We're going to get into another section on elections now, but I want to stop and talk about lobbying and advocacy if folks have questions. So Nina, to circle back on your question, what you cannot do is spend more on lobbying than your 501h election. In this next section where we talk about elections, there's a lot of things you cannot do, so stay tuned for that. But with respect to lobbying, you just can't spend more than the 501h allows. Does anyone else have questions about lobbying in their work, or work that they've done before, or work that they're thinking they want to incorporate moving forward?
I do have a quick question. So does that, going back to that, when you talk about what the organization can and can't do, would it be best to have one person then identified in the organization to do? If you are doing some level of lobbying, does it make sense to have one person doing it? Or, and is there a certain like level of staff or certain people that can do certain activities? I'm just wondering.
Yeah.
You know, are we talking about like the board member? You know, like, I'm just trying to
totally
think. You get, I don't want to sound like I'm trying to break the law, but like, how would it be determined that you know, exceeded?
right.
The wrong person was
Yeah,
lobbying versus some other person in the agency.
Right. Yeah, so about the, like, is it best to have one person question? I certainly think there are advantages to that, right? It's way easier to track how much time one person spends on doing something versus like having a couple of folks. So if you're having one or more than one person doing lobbying, again, like direct lobbying, talking to legislators about specific bills, you do have to record their staff time, right? And that has to be seen as a lobbying expense. Now, to get to your question about board members or volunteers, right? The 501h election only measures dollars spent. So if you sent volunteer lobbyists who you didn't pay a dime to, any lobbying they do on behalf of your organization is not, there's nothing to be recorded. You didn't spend any money. So it always comes down to what you can spend on lobbying. If you can get your lobbying done without spending any money, best I can tell, and by everything I've been told, you're not spending money on lobbying, and that's fine. I will say one more time, I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. And at the end, I am going to point you to an organization that like this is what they do, helping nonprofits understand this. This is their whole thing. And so if you have more specific things about it, you can maybe ask them about it. But hopefully that sort of answers your question, Nina. Anybody else have questions about lobbying? All right, well then we will move on. All right, this is the last big section, if you recall from the agenda. Partisan political activities and elections. Let's get into it. So let's first talk about what is a partisan political activity, even though for many of us, this is probably clear from the name, but it is clear support or opposition to candidates for public office during an election. So here's just a list of things that includes. Candidate pledges. If you've seen organizations that are like, these candidates have taken our pledge to not do X, Y, or Z, or to definitely do X, Y, or Z. A 501c3 can't do that. Give money to campaigns, campaign contributions. A 501c3 cannot do that. Doing partisan voter registration or get out the vote, that's what GOTV stands for. If it's partisan, if you're targeting people because you think that they will do what you need them to do, that's not legal. Endorsing candidates or recommending candidates is, again, included in partisan political activity, not allowed. And any sort of organizational communication that calls for support or opposition to a candidate. Now, candidate versus like elected official, right? If they're elected, if they're already in office, it is a little bit of a gray area whether or not when you do this close to an election, are they more candidate or more office holder? That can get a little fuzzy there. But if they're like just running for the office and they aren't already in that office, they are definitely a candidate, and communications that ask people to support or oppose their candidacy are not allowed. All right, so this is a big thing. 501c3, yes.
Sorry, we had a question about lobbying come through a little late, but it's from Alexa. Can you give an example of how Georgia Equality manages their lobbying?
Yes, what I will say on that is, since we have a 501c4 in addition to our 501c3, we very rarely, we don't have a ton of lobbying that comes from the C3, and we do it mostly with our 501c4. So Georgia Equality employs a full-time lobbyist year-round, and that person is paid out of the 501c4. One thing that is sort of notable is all of our employees at Georgia Equality are employed by the 501c3 organization, and any work that we do, any 501c4 work we do is tracked on a timesheet, and then the 501c4 organization has to pay the 501c3 organization for our time that we spent on their work. So that's some of the ways that we do it, and there are lots of other ways, but I think the larger point that comes through from Alexa's question is you're gonna have to track it. You have to keep up with what's spending. So, okay, 501c3 organizations and partisan political activities, just like take it all in. No, do not do it, do not do it. The best way to endanger your tax exempt status, your nonprofit status, is to engage in partisan political activities. Again, these rules apply to everything coming out of your organization, written, spoken, digital, social media, whatever. If it's an official organizational communication, text message, voicemail, phone call, anything, it is not allowed. Nina, yes, organizations, but not individuals. and this is an important line to draw, right? Like, you sort of have to understand when you as a person are doing anything of these in this thing, are you doing it as an employee of your organization, or are you doing it as an individual? If you're doing it as an individual, it doesn't matter. Just because you work somewhere doesn't mean you can't do, doesn't mean you as a private citizen can't speak to your legislator about a specific piece of legislation. But you do need to be very careful about it. As an example, whenever we're at the state capitol on lobby days, I make it a point to speak to my state legislators who I know, just to make sure that they know that we're there and have heard from someone, and they're all good on Georgia equality issues. So there's rarely a lot of asks, but keeping them informed and checking in with them. But when I do that, they know that I work for Georgia Equality, but I don't mention Georgia Equality at all. If I'm wearing a Georgia Equality name tag or pin, I take it off. And that may be silly. It's probably unnecessary, but it's just like operating out of to be very cautious about it. But yes, organizations, not individuals. So like, if you post something on your personal Facebook page, that doesn't count just because you work for a 501c3. If you post that same thing on the 501c3's Facebook page, then it's different. Okay, so, but don't get discouraged yet. Can 501c3s play during elections? Yes, there are absolutely things that you can be doing during elections. A running thread through this entire presentation is issue advocacy. Again, as long as you stay on an issue and not, don't talk about a specific piece of legislation or a specific candidate, you're golden. If you're doing, you can do on your issues candidate education, but you have to do it in a nonpartisan way, meaning any educational materials or meetings that you're offering to candidates, you have to offer to all candidates for that particular office. You can't just say you want to meet with the Democrat or the Republican. You got to meet with both or all if there are more than 2 candidates. You can absolutely do voter registration. Let me say as a note, obviously for the upcoming election, the voter registration deadline is passed, but nonpartisan voter registration you can do. If you're running a voter registration drive, you cannot turn anyone away that comes to register. And you cannot offer incentives. So, if you are doing a voter registration drive and you have like a bowl of candy on the table and someone comes up, can I have that? And you register to vote, then you can have candy. That's illegal. Don't say that. Anyone can have your candy. You just hope it brings them to your table so that you could ask them about registering to vote and check in on their voter registration status and make sure they're registered. So no partisan targeting and no incentives. Voter outreach, for example, get out the vote, totally allowed. This is, go back. An example of a get out the vote piece that we did with is obviously a screenshot that I need to correct because it has a drop-down menu in it. But anyhow, this is a 100% 501c3 get out the vote piece. It just says vote. It says your voice matters. It tells you to register online or by mail and gives you some important dates, has the organizational branding, no mention of a candidate, really no mention, well, it has the election day on it. So this is totally allowed. This is totally 501c3 fine. Voter education is allowed on, but this section does get a little hairy. So if you're going to do a candidate questionnaire that you publish, or you're going to publish voting records, talk to a lawyer before you do it, just because you have to be really measured in the way that you do it equally to candidates. You have to apply these things equally to candidates. So pay attention to that. Lastly, ballot measures. They are not considered political activities. You can talk for or against ballot measures as much as you want. All right. Any questions about what we can and can't do during elections as 501c3s? You can put them in the chat, or you can say them. Any questions about the elections piece? Nina says, what's a ballot measure? Excellent question. A ballot measure is like any question that's being asked of the voters on the ballot. So if you go vote, when you go vote in this election cycle, we have 4 ballot measures on the Georgia state ballot this year. A couple of them are constitutional amendments asking if we want to do amend the Constitution to do 1 or 2 things. But it's just, you're not voting for a candidate. It's asking you a question to take a position. It really wants to know what people think about the electorate thinks about an issue. That's a ballot measure. All right. Just a couple more things now. What if you as an organization do something wrong? What happens? There are a couple of things that can happen. I will say that, like, in my experience working with nonprofit organizations about lobbying, people always jump to, we can't do that, we'll lose our tax exempt status. That's the first thing and the only thing they say, and that's it. My point with this list is, like, it's the third of the 3. It would be very rare, I think, for you to mess up one time and the IRS just to, like, strip your tax exempt status away immediately, right? Generally, the first letter is going to be a warning letter. If after a warning letter, you're still doing the bad thing, they may make you pay tax on that, meaning like a temporary loss of your tax exempt status. And then if you're a habitual offender, it's likely that they will, the IRS will revoke your tax exempt status or revoke your 501c3 status. But you don't have to, just don't do it wrong. There are lots of ways you can engage. And again, being really careful with your tracking, and just making sure you speak at least with like an attorney in a consulting sense, just to like make sure you're good to go. So I just want to say as the last piece then, here are a couple of places that you can get some more information if you're looking for it. Firstly, the IRS has a pretty in-depth interactive course on their website that explores different pieces of what it means to be sorry, Tammy Kinney just joined. Hey, Tammy. So they have different things on their website of what it means to be tax exempt, and they have lots of questions, but it's an interactive course that you can sit and go through and like watch the presentations. And it's actually, like, considering that it's produced by the IRS, it is very good. Another source of information is me. If you have questions from today or ever anything comes up, feel welcome to send me an email. I'll give you my best thoughts on things. I'm reiterating here, not a lawyer. And then the third one I mentioned earlier, I was going to refer you to another organization, Boulder Advocacy at the Alliance for Justice. Their whole purpose is to help 501c3s understand how they can lobby, what's allowed, what activities they can do to impact policy and elections. So that's their whole deal. They would be more than happy to help you, and they are great. And they have lawyers. They're actual lawyers. They will not represent you. They will not be a legal representation, but they will happily answer your questions about what you can and can't do. So the next slide just says questions, I believe. So we'll take questions, but I'm going to leave this slide up here for folks if you want to take this information down. What we are at 2:47. So we got 13 minutes left, but if we don't need it all, we'll just return some time to you. But do folks have any last, lingering questions? Have anything come up for folks? Do anyone want to talk about scenarios of something you've done or want an opinion on?
I do have a quick question. I know I'm kind of monopolizing. I don't want to monopolize everybody's.
No, you're the only one talking. I love you, Nina.
But so I'm in one of the historically Black sororities, and of course, Kamala Harris is a member of the sorority. And one question, I saw a couple of posts where people were saying that organizations people shouldn't wear their letters when they go to, it was something about they shouldn't, if they're endorsing a certain candidate, they shouldn't wear their sorority letters because that was representing the organization. And so a lot of people were going back and forth in different posts talking about, if you post your picture, when you go to vote, be careful about talking about which, candidate you're endorsing or you're supporting. And it seems like that's kind of a myth, but I just wanted to bring that up and talk about it, because I know there have been some back and forth about organizations whose members end up wearing their letters while they're endorsing a candidate, could be putting the organization in an awkward position. But I think what
I think
that's not true.
I think that you're right, that that's not true. I think it's a really good question and a really interesting question. But the first thing that I would say is, like, from my perspective, I would say that the only part of this that might get hairy is if, no, I don't think there's anything that could happen that would be bad about this. But, like, I'm just trying to think about it from, like, the organization taking an action. That's what we have to be worried about. So if the organization told people to wear their letters to the polls, but the letters of a fraternity or sorority are not politically active. I think there for sure are rules on what you can and can't do and wear and say in the polling place while you're voting. If you're in line to vote, you're not allowed to, like, campaign, obviously, but an AKA shirt, sweatshirt, jersey, whatever you've got, as far as I can tell, is not political. Like, it's not saying, but now let me say, you can't say AKAs for Kamala. You, like, don't wear that shirt into the polling place. But if it's just your letters, I think it's fine.
Okay.
Wes?
Yeah.
This is Alexa. That makes me think that is a good question, Nina. Because say there's an example like a group of AKAs gathering together as AKAs to go somewhere to have a mini little rally in support of Kamala. That's gray. What do you think about that?
I think a group of AKAs doing that is just fine. If, like, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated as an organization hosts an event for a candidate, that is a different thing.
Okay.
But, like,
it depends on
you
how
just getting
actually
together.
The gathering.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of a gray area, but there would have to be, like, a specific piece of organizational communication that says we are supporting Kamala Harris or whoever the candidate is. It's a candidate piece that is hairy. You could do, I think there was, like, a lot of us have probably seen a picture of, like, many of the historically Black sororities, women wearing, like, their jerseys, but it was, like, several organizations saying they were strolling to the polls. I thought that was beautiful, totally legal, nothing wrong at all. Do it.